Startups get the party started. Startups get the party. Startups get the party started. You want tech and tacos, tacos and tech. You know we got tacos and tech is on smash. For the green guacamole. Keep accountants counting beans. Contador cuentan frijoles. Founders trying to raise some queso. La vida San Diego. School of rappy, rapping fire. Tortillas round jalapenos. In these modern times of craft beer and coffee. My coding yoga posse. Fold the body, origami. We be surfing Coronado. Eating tacos el gordo. The taco stand in puesto. Lucha libre and sombrero. Gotta shout out Tecos Angels by the ocean. Watch the sunset. La Jolla Shores. Entrepreneurs trying to get funded. When San Diego Startup Week is popping in the summer. Oceanside to Tijuana. SD be full of hustlers. From couch surfing to penthouses right on the beach. Tech leaders who believe stars are within reach. We interviewing founders who be shooting for the moon. Hashtag SD Techos with your host, Neal Bloom. Come on. Startups get the party. Startups get the
Welcome to the Tacos and Tech podcast, where we discover cutting-edge San Diego technologies and the builders making it happen. I'm your host, Neal Bloom, San Diego's tech ambassador, and together, we're going to put a face to the name of today's tech leaders with our own blend of local lifestyle.
Startups get the party. Startups get the party started. Startups get the party. Startups get the party.
I want to take a moment to thank our friends at Cox Business, who have enabled us to tell these amazing stories of local leaders, technologists, founders, and funders. Cox is actually a 121-year-old family-run business that thinks in terms of decades in building community, a lot like we do in building our startup ecosystem. For years, the local Cox Business team has helped us grow through partnering at San Diego Startup Week, SD Quick Pitch, and celebrating our local technical leaders at the Top Tech Awards. The Top Tech Awards are happening later this year, but applications are open now to submit for your favorite CTO, CIO, or VP of engineering to be recognized as a top tech leader. You can apply now at toptechawards.com. Thanks again to Cox Business.
It's a really funny story how this came about. So, the recent rocket launch, I was a huge fan of space and NASA as a child. As you can see, I've got the retro, what they call the worm logo here from the early 80s, which was my, that was what I was inspired by. And I was tweeting about the recent launch, and Neal had mentioned, oh, by the way, I used to launch the Space Shuttle. And me being a child of the 80s and being, so profoundly impacted by it, I just lost my mind and was like, I did not know that. And we need to talk a little bit more about that. And so that's kind of where this transpired from. So I was super excited when Neal had mentioned his background. And I thought, this would be, and actually it was a show that was like, we need to get you together. And what better time to talk about, Neal's experience and then tie it into, how we can get involved as investors. And Neal was like, I know. So without further ado, I will let Neal kick this off and talk a little bit about the history, kind of set the time and the place, and then talk a little bit about what he did and how that led him to the startup world.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks everyone for having me. Most of you know me kind of from the software side and just evangelist of tech ecosystems. But I actually started my young entrepreneurial career, or my young career in aerospace. I'm a UCSD grad, mechanical engineer, undergrad, and then my first full-time job, I applied online to a company called Pratt Whitney Rocketdyne, which I applied to like 50 places because in 2008, man, it was not easy to get a job. But luckily, engineers were still getting jobs, and ended up in LA in Canoga Park, which had been kind of the site of all rocket propulsion since the mid-50s. Since the days of Wernher von Braun, somehow randomly Rocketdyne had become the place where all rocket engines had been developed for every manned launch system since the beginning for the US. So I was lucky enough to join a company that had huge history in this area. Not something I was ever dreaming of becoming a part of, but once I worked with hundreds of thousands of engineers where all they wanted to do all day was put people in space, I took the Kool-Aid and I was super into it. So really, really amazing experience for 5 years. I got to work on specifically rocket propulsion. So we'll dive deeper into like rockets in general, but my background specifically is the engine. So propulsion, just the business side of rockets. One of the coolest things I think about space, and what's different about space compared to like say defense, is that it is insanely collaborative, worldwide and private partner, almost to its detriment sometimes, which we'll talk about on the politics side in a few slides. So we'll get there. We're going to talk a little bit about Space Shuttle, which is going to be more kind of retro. It's in the past, but there's a lot of elements that are being used for future rocket development. So my area of focus was test and launch performance engineer. And honestly, the easiest answer, what that sounds like and looks like for the software world, is a product manager. So I owned our engines from the moment they were done being manufactured all the way through launch. Our engines specifically were reusable. So when they came back after 2 weeks in space, I then was in charge of building the plan for how to get them ready to be launched again. So I was colloquially known as engine mom. There was 3 of us on a team. We each had about 6 engines that we owned. I knew my engine numbers. I knew the hardware on it. I knew them very well. Engine 2050, one of my favorites. And so I was there for testing every brand new engine, as well as any spare hardware. And then I was there for launch day. And sometimes I was in Florida. Sometimes I was at our headquarters in Canoga Park. Depends on if it was my launch or not between my team of 3. But we always, on launch day, our team, we're always monitoring for about 10 hours pre-launch. And I'll walk you through what a launch is like as well. I was a part of 12 launches and 130 engine tests. And honestly, the tests took up way more of my time. We only launched 4 to 5 rockets a year, space shuttles. So, 360 days a year, I was working on testing and making sure we always had spare hardware. Or when they retired the shuttle, I was in charge of the next program, which was a staged rocket, kind of like the SpaceX style today, where it's got multiple stages. We were in charge of stage 2, and I was part of that test program. So something happened, though, that got me to where you guys know me today. They retired the space shuttle, and I stayed, but like 65% of the workforce was laid off. And I had some crazy survivor guilt. I did not deserve to, as a 25-year-old, to continue working on the space program when people for 30 years, that's all they ever wanted to do. And so I actually started working with another coworker of mine, Adam Markowitz, on a way to help engineers retool and remarket themselves for the new workforce. How do they talk about what their skill sets are good for rockets in any other kind of industry? And that today became Portfolio. We had some major pivots, and it became more of a student job tool, but it really was built for engineers based on the experiences we had with the Space Shuttle program. So that picture there on the right is me with, I think, STS-134. So not the very last, but the second to last Space Shuttle. It's humongous. This really doesn't show scale at all, but that thing is, I think, 250 feet tall. It's massive. I think we're just standing at a weird angle so that you get the whole thing in one shot. A little bit about the Space Shuttle engine itself. And this is more just to nerd out on some really interesting, weird stats. The Space Shuttle main engine, which those are on the right-hand side, there's the 3 that stick out the back of the orbiter. These are about the same size as your average jet engine, a fighter jet engine. So 14 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 8,000 pounds. The difference is a fighter jet engine puts out about 17,000 pounds of thrust, while this puts out 500,000 pounds of thrust. So a completely different magnitude order of thrust that these engines can do. The difference is obviously the fuel tank. That's obviously that huge orange tank is humongous, and a lot of the lift needed for this whole orbiter stack itself is for the fuel tank in its own right because of how massive it is. But those 3 engines, when you were launched the Space Shuttle, they were on from ground all the way till you get to space, 8.5 minutes. And that's the biggest difference for every rocket that's ever been designed from way back in the 50s, 60s, all the way through SpaceX now, is that most rockets are not designed to operationally work from sea level to 300 miles up into space. Because of the changing pressures at different altitudes, you usually can't have rocket engines. They're just too expensive to be able to work at all those different varieties. But that was what this engine was designed for, was to be able to work at every potential possibility from a performance perspective. And that's why it was so expensive, to be honest. It was because it was the Ferrari of engines, really. Something else, some pretty huge extremes. We're working at negative 420 degrees of liquid oxygen, negative 340 degrees, hydrogen and oxygen. These two combine to combust at 6,000 degrees, which melts iron. And so you have to develop some pretty unique materials specifically for this engine. And what that all creates is water vapor. You're really just combining two basic elements that are very clean burning, which is incredible. Stage combustion. I'm going to explain this on the next page, but really you've got three rocket engines within one engine. So you have a turbopump mentality where you're burning all the propellants to spin the pumps to get them to perform at a higher pressure, and then igniting them all over again. The exhaust is used as the fuel all over again in here. I'm going to play a video of a start. It's one of my favorite videos because it's in slow motion. And through here, I'm going to talk through the launch sequence that I was involved in. So while this is what's about to happen is, few seconds here on Earth, I was on console for 10 hours before every launch to make sure that our engines were okay to be able to run. Because of such extreme temperatures, negative 400 degrees, that does some weird things to metal, as you can imagine. It makes things bend. It makes sensors read really weird things. And so we had to let the whole space shuttle condition itself for 4 to 6 hours before it was ready to be launched. And that's mostly because of the hydrogen. And so like last month, SpaceX, you didn't use hydrogen, uses kerosene, and it is much easier, much simpler in terms of getting ready for launch. So right here, you see the three engines start. They start for about 7 seconds. It takes them to get to a steady state. We say, okay, they look good. And the astronauts could still abort if they needed to, but at this point, you can see the mock diamonds. They have fully formed. That usually means we've got about a second left. And then the two giant white rockets on the sides, they will kick off. Once those start, you cannot turn off. What's not seen here, but there's so much force that comes out of here. This whole engine here is wobbling. And if you could think of 4 or 5 inch thick metal wobbling and bending, it's insane. You wouldn't expect that whatsoever when you feel how thick that metal is. Just seeing the startup sequence for me is always really, really incredible. So all that obviously happens within milliseconds, but because of the cameras, we have to always monitor like everything, tiles that are falling, the instrumentation inside even this pad and platform. We have to go and kind of make sure it works, as Michael can really attest to, since he built the part of the pad here. It looks like there is a lot of oversight over just launching 7 people into space. One other thing to talk through. So, Space Shuttle 81 through 2011, SpaceX launch was just purely satellites, but just first manned in 2020. And now the Artemis program, which has honestly been in development since I think the Bush era, but under different names and different objectives, has at least since 2017 has a goal of getting to the moon by 2024. And you'll see these are iterations as well that are being used. And you'll notice a lot of similar looking colors, at least. This is the same design of the Space Shuttle's orange fuel and oxygen tank, because they're using the same Space Shuttle main engines on the bottom. They're just using 4 of them. They're also using the same SRBs, but they're using taller ones. So all this is going to have more thrust. But they're smart in that they're vertically integrating meaning like pieces will fall off. It's not something that's going to have to go all the way to space. It'll be staged as well. And they're using technology that's been developed over the last 30, 40 years. So it doesn't have to have as much money to go into it. And so that's kind of a saving grace with the next manned program, which the goal is purely get man on the moon. And then there is a follow-on of what does Mars look like. But these are not, I don't believe any of the Artemis ones are designed for Mars right now. What is interesting around this is the capsules on each of these tops are going to be designed by third-party companies. So SpaceX has a proposal in, I think this is their style. Blue Origin, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, also has been down selected for a capsule, and one other. This is separate than what SpaceX just launched last month, which is purely a contract just to bring humans to space station. So that is, space station now is, it's still a full-time presence in space that we want to maintain, but it's no longer like about exploration. It is more just science experimentation, both on the human body and other science. And so SpaceX and Boeing have the contract to pretty much just taxi people and separately supplies to the astronauts who are full-time in space. And they've been full-time since 1998, which is pretty cool to have had a full-time human presence that long now. So NASA's budget is tiny. This is a percent of the federal budget is what I'm showing here. It sits between 0.5%, 1%. Right now, it actually is pretty high at 20 billion. It's honestly averaged between 13 to 18 billion for the last 20 years. That is not a lot. An aircraft carrier right now is built for $13 billion. So the entire space program of the United States, at least NASA's, is done for maybe an aircraft carrier battle group. And I'm saying specifically to defense because of the massive scale of difference of what we spend on space versus what defense spends in general. And there's a few reasons for this. Space is largely looked at as like, what's the greater, bigger impact on humanity? Honestly, it's mostly technology driven and education. It really is about, and there's some diplomacy too. The fact that we can show that we're working hand in hand with Russia, Japan, Italy, Canada, like all these different nations to
35 different individual space programs now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Incredible.
That's amazing.
All for, $20 billion and that includes, by the way, stuff that's done. That's like research on Earth too. That includes deep space probes that we've had running since the 70s. That includes a lot of NASA's weather satellites that they have around the world too. So that's like, you get a lot of bang for your buck for that $20 billion, as well as some of the smartest scientists and engineers on Earth working on these things, working on things for good. So pretty incredible, but not a lot of attention. It gets a lot of attention, but for not a lot that comes out of it per se. And so some of the things that happen in space is that because it can take 10 to 20 years to build that rocket, you obviously go through a lot of administration changes. So all of a sudden we want to go to Mars. Well, now let's go to an asteroid. Oh, okay. That's different parameters. We got to design a new rocket. Scrap that. Let's start over again. That happens a lot.
Didn't Obama have an initiative of asteroid landing and maybe Mars too, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So that's every administration has kind of had ideas, and that changes and that restarts development cycles big time. Especially when NASA is the sole one building the hardware, or at least not building, but they are the one developing everything. What we've now seen, what's great is having this commercial private side. So SpaceX, while yes, they are NASA's customer, they're developing things that they want to develop that hopefully fits, and selling it to NASA saying, this is the way to get to space, as opposed to the other way where Boeing and Lockheed may say, hey, NASA, just tell us what you want and we'll make it for you. And kind of getting wagged in that regard, where NASA will change their mind and Boeing saying, okay, that's fine. We'll scrap it and work on the next thing. When you have a private company and you're able to fund it on your own first, you can build, what you want and kind of push the government into designing and saying, this is what you need. So I think SpaceX has been huge for that and keeping us on track in that regard. Another big hindrance, I will call it, it's been touted as good and diplomatic, but if you look at this slide, every state touches the space program, which means a lot of oversight for NASA. This means that there's probably a private contractor who's developing something, and you probably can akin this to kind of the automobile industry, in terms of the supplier aspect. But it actually, for one vehicle, it really makes it complicated. And SpaceX has proven that when they build the entire rocket themselves, they get it done for cheaper, like significantly cheaper. You don't need to have all the shipping of one little piece that goes to the next place, which needs to all be inspected by NASA. SpaceX probably sits in 3 states. They sit in California, Texas, and Florida, and they get it all done. They've completely vertically integrate, and that's what private really means, is the vertical integration, as opposed to NASA, which says we're going to pick a prime contractor and then thousands of subprime contractors to build this. And the reason that NASA's had to do that is to just guarantee that every senator will just vote to maintain their budget, because it's so easy to just say, oh, $1 billion for the space program, that doesn't affect my constituency. I don't care. I'll put that towards highway construction or something else. And so SpaceX or NASA has really, over the last 20, 30 years, really distributed itself to make sure that every senator has skin in the game to keep voting for that budget. Good and bad. That's the trend right now, is to vertically integrate and not have to be so concentrated around the entire country.
Very interesting.
Okay, so let's talk about the kind of the future of space. We talked about like where the manned future of space is. That will continue to be because of 1 to 2 customers. NASA, maybe someone else, will come to say, hey, we want to build our own private space station. I don't know. That's not where the big growth is. The big growth is really in satellites and other things around that. So the industry is booming because satellites have gotten so much smaller, and really around the telecommunication aspect. You can beam internet with a tiny little nano satellite now. And that's what's really driving the growth of space. But what's great about that is that SpaceX and others like it, being private, have been able to use NASA dollars to develop rockets for manned space that can also be used for private stuff too. So satellites and maybe even energy one day too. So you will see huge growth in just space in general, but know that that is not going to be as big for manned space. Mm-hmm. It'll be for other areas. And we can talk a little bit about what I think those other areas, this is my perception, what we will see. Satellites, some have been there for years, decades. Some of these are $1 billion satellites put up by the National Reconnaissance Office. They're one of the largest suppliers or spenders of satellites. These are $1 billion satellites that, you don't really want to have to replace. And so if there's a lot around refueling and reusing existing hardware that's already in space. I think we'll see more of that.
So there's a couple of questions coming in. Michael had a question about tech transfer. Is there tech transfer between the U.S. military and NASA?
Yeah, there is, especially in the propulsion side. You'll see that the Air Force, which is pretty much the largest they're kind of the NASA of rockets for anything non-manned. They launch most of, the reconnaissance satellites and things like that. They will pay for us as a U.S. to have dominance in a lot of aspects of rocketry. So, you'll get, even Elon, SpaceX got some of its early funding from Air Force just to verify that we can produce this kind of rocket technology. So that's kind of the grant side that you'll see, in a sense, to go to these, is the military, that they want to make sure that we have the capabilities that are better than any other country. Right now, the big push are in 2 areas: alternative fuels, and alternative only meaning things we haven't used. Methane is one area that we have not built engines in before, but Blue Origin is championing the use of methane. I guess there's 3 areas: alternative fuels, also trying to get our reliance off of Russian engines. So we actually still use a lot of we use 2 different main Russian engines for launching some of our satellites, which is a huge problem because they launch some of the US's defense satellites. The Atlas V is kind of the workhorse of satellite launchers for the National Reconnaissance Office, these $1 billion satellites I talked about. And we really need to stop relying on Russia. We need to be able to launch our own rocket engines, just like we also need to be able to launch our own people. So that's another area, is building pretty large scale engines to replace on the Atlas V. And then the third area, it just escaped me. Hypersonics. So this is kind of the next aspect of air breathing engines to get to the highest Mach levels. This is kind of taking the Concorde to the next level of really high air fast travel. So those are kind of the three areas that I'm seeing a lot of spend right now in terms of kind of from a propulsion area. The picks and shovels piece, though, you're seeing these other areas here, in space propulsion. So this is how else besides just liquid rocket engines could we get and travel in space. This is what Michael mentioned about nuclear propulsion. There's also things as plasma and solar energy, even solar kites, as they call them. So using photons to actually push a giant kite. This is a whole area that we could see some development and investment. In space GPS. So all the GPS satellites right now point back to Earth, and they've mapped Earth really well. We have Google Maps on our phone, but we don't know anything around kind of a coordinate system outside of Earth. And so there is kind of, I think, a whole, once we start seeing travel to other areas, an asteroid, moon, we're going to want to map it. And I think there'll be a whole effort to put GPS in space GPS, where we map our solar system from a coordinate and quadrant area. And then once we're traveling in space, radiation protection is going to be huge. So you'll see a lot of investment around just protecting humans in space. You see a lot around how long can humans stay in space right now. And just, I think in February, one of the female US astronauts took the new record for the longest time in space.
Wow.
And that is going to keep getting bumped up. I think we're going to keep pushing to see how long can humans get there if we really expect that we can get to Mars, which potentially could be like 18 months or longer. And we need to see what that does to the human body. So these are just areas that I think are going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah. I mean, before we jump into, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, like, again, how us as an angel group could get involved early in some of these companies. But there was a really interesting comment on the chat channel, which is something that I think about a lot, and it's a lot about like ownership of space. Like, I know the Outer Space Treaty, the UN Outer Space Treaty exists, right? You can't weaponize things like the moon or celestial bodies or put weapons of mass destruction into orbit, which would make a lot of the James Bond villains, I think, would be violating that. I can think of Diamonds Are Forever, I think. Anyways. But there's a question here about ownership, and it says, so space assets, for example, when we get into asteroid mining, is it finders keepers when it comes into claiming ownership of territory or resources, or are we just applying maritime law into space? So I don't know if the Outer Space Treaty covers that, or.
Yeah, I don't have a good sense of this. I think Moon is going to be where we all first kind of figure that out. Now that we've had, I think it's 4 countries have now landed something on the Moon. Maybe 5. China, India, US, Russia, I think. I can't remember if they actually have. And then Israel, I think, tried something recently too. So I think that is going to be interesting to watch what happens there. We could look at an Antarctica model where we've kind of given quadrants, like saying these areas are, you can have a base at, this is where the US can have a base, and kind of come together and say that. But yeah, I have no idea how to bite that off on the diplomacy of space piece.
So I do want to talk a little bit about how we can get involved as an angel group. There's one more interesting question. I'm such a nerd. There's a really interesting question here from Michael again about radiation. And he says, I see your slide says radiation protection listed. When I was assigned to a nuclear submarine, we would receive more radiation by a factor of 100x. Wow. On a cross-country airline flight than we would in week underway. The radiation levels must be far worse in space. Can you comment?
Yeah, there's a lot of research continuously being done on this, but the space station is very much highly protected, I would say, from this. That is the number one importance, is making sure that you are not coming home with cancer after spending 300 days in space. And from what we've seen, it is not too significant from some of these astronauts who are coming down 10, 20, 30 years later after spending this much time in space. So I think it's a testament to that focus of building the space station in that way. I think it's still to be determined, since we just had, I think her name is Peggy, who just spent 370 days. It's the longest now. That just happened in February. So we don't really know what happens to the body for more than a year. But like you said, like one airline flight could produce more. No, we've got the materials to keep people protected in space, at least from a year-long perspective. So far it's been good. But I think we will be doing more research there to see what else we can be doing.
Great. And there's some comments from Ted about small satellites. He was talking about small satellites. A friend of him is at Georgia Tech, is working on small satellites. Sure. I don't know if that's something that is on your radar and could be investable. So
yeah, this is the hugest, biggest area of space, I think, to invest in for all of us. Nanosats are kind of the smallest, tiny little area. SpaceX is launching. SpaceX in the last few years has put up a 500 satellite fleet. They now have 500 satellites in space that they've launched. They put up 60 just last week with one rocket launch. Because of what telecommunications has really miniaturized ourselves to. Satellites are absolutely shrinking to such a high level, or a small level. And what this is typically, we're seeing it for, is like beaming communications, internet, broadband, other things like that. And like you'll see SpaceX right now is, if you read more into their I think it's called Starlink, 500 satellites, where they are, they still have to kind of find a customer. They just put the satellites up, and because it's so cheap for them, and now they have to go prove that they can meet FCC's requirements. So I believe they're under their gun to test that they can hit some specific wavelength by October to hit a pretty massive grant by the FCC for satellite communication. And the same with, I believe Facebook or Google has a satellite that they've launched too. Like it's really all about getting the entire world connected to the internet or other telecommunication. And so these satellites have just come down so much in price because big tech and private industry are paying for it, which is great to have so many customers. So that, I think, is where you'll see a lot of the funding going for startups, either related to launching tiny rockets that can launch a nanosat, or bigger rockets that can launch a whole bunch. And this could be for a bunch of customers. Some areas to focus on for that. So we've mentioned, Rocket Lab is kind of one of the newer and larger companies that is building kind of full rockets. But there's a bunch of companies that you can look up that are raising for the kind of ecosystem around satellites. Now, the hardest thing for angels is how much money that needs to go into these companies to start it. Look at SpaceX. Its very first raise was $60 million. It probably already had some of Elon's money ahead of that too. But still, that first raise was $60 million, and they've gone on to raise $3.2 billion over 18 years. They're valued at, people say, around $33 billion. You actually could, I hear there are secondaries right now to buy a SpaceX stock.
They also have a lot of grants too.
They do. They have a lot of grants for sure. And they've gotten a lot of customers. Well, not a lot of customers. Like NASA has given them money now to get to where they're at.
So, for example, if I looked up Rocket Lab on PitchBook, and their Series A, I mean, granted, this was a few years ago. Their Series A was only $5 million on an $8 million pre-valuation. So, I mean, again, that was a few years ago. Yeah, some of the, I was looking up, and some of them were pretty reasonable in their early stages. It's about like, how do you identify and where do we find these deals, right?
Yep. I think LA is definitely much further ahead than us in terms of an ecosystem for rockets. The El Segundo, kind of that whole aerospace coast is very well suited for talent. But I think really the biggest thing that we can do is follow the talent. And so I've seen deals come through where it's 2 former SpaceX people starting blank X thing. I think it's that aspect of getting to know the talent and seeing what they're doing. Another area, this is kind of early talent, but UCSD has 2 different rocket clubs, 2 student clubs that I actually sponsored when I was at Rocketdyne. And I love keeping track and saying, where are these people now? You know, they've gone on to SpaceX and others. And I look to when are they going to start their own? So for me, it's very much talent based. Where are people coming from? Getting to know them from your own industry. And then asking our LA chapter to send us some of those deals in San Diego, as well as we have a member, Ellen Chang, who is an aerospace focused investor. And so if we want to see more deals, let's ask for it.
Yeah, that would be great. We do need to ask her because that is it. I mean, she is focused on that. So yeah, I was doing a lot of research, and a lot of these companies, yes, some of them are older, but their first couple of rounds were pretty modest. So just a matter of, getting in front of them.
Yeah. I think the for me is looking at, are they picks and shovels, or are they going to go for big? And I think if you're going to build your whole rocket yourself, you really have to understand where you can get those grants and early funding that will take you way past like meeting customers, So this is going to come from.
What do you mean by picks and shovels?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah. So the picks and shovels idea is around kind of the services around this. So this is 3D printing, specifically for rocket engines or for unique alloy metals.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah. So the reference
the gold rush, right?
From the gold rush. Yeah. It's the references from the gold rush.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Or it could be a whole new software that is for, designing something for rocketry.
Yeah, Neal, I had a question. As a company, I remember at UCSD, I think they were doing sort of workflow software for aerospace. Do you know, are there other examples like that you've seen in town that maybe we might look out for?
Yes. There was one, I think they've since shut down. It was called ARC, and I'm trying to remember what ARC stood for. But I think that's who you're talking about.
Additive Rocket Corporation.
Additive Rocket Corp. Yep.
Yeah, they're still up and running.
Oh, good. Okay.
We moved a little bit away from aerospace. The other company that started out of Tri-D. You remember that?
Tri-D. I do. I can't remember what they did.
Doing printing and design of valves.
3D printed design. Okay, got it. Yep, I remember that. And that comes probably exactly from the club they were from. There was a 3D printed rocket club.
Yeah. And they can, these both of these things came through my lab that every short food lab is running that. Tri-D raised about $1 million in VC and OVC funding up 2 years ago.
Okay.
Moved up to the LA area.
Got it.
Hey, Neal, one more question for you. You mentioned orbital debris and how it tends to stay up there. One of the questions I've never really been able to quite understand is why is it that we have to continually update, for example, satellite orbits and make fine adjustments to them, otherwise they would decay and fall to the Earth, and why the space debris doesn't suffer that same problem?
Ooh, good science physics question. What's the right answer?
Maybe Caitlin can answer. I don't know.
So I know it's, I think it is related to drag of some sort. And so the size of satellites, that it eventually gets to a place that it does get to some atmospheric effects. And so it pulls it down quicker, I believe, versus like little pieces, they just don't catch atmosphere the same way, and so just kind of stay in rotation, I believe. I also don't know what size constitutes. I can't claim Oh, Michael can answer. I'm going to stop
Michael
talking.
says he's got the answer. Let's let
Please,
him.
Michael.
Okay, so every orbital object is not in a perfect orbit. They're, for whatever reason, they don't have a perfect orbit that puts them up there forever, but it puts them up there for a long time. And most of the larger satellites, anything of value, has orbital thrusters to adjust the orbit so they don't dip down into the atmosphere where there's some resistance and then they fall out of orbit. The space debris, there's so much of it that, sure, some of it touches the atmosphere, falls out of orbit, and burns up in reentry. But again, there's so much of it that it's still a huge problem.
Got it. Thank you. And do you see a business case for cleaning some of that debris, whether it's from ground-based lasers or whether it's actual mechanical devices out in space that go out and clean them up, or is that still too far away?
Well, I think there's a huge need for it. The amount of debris that was put into orbit when the Chinese blew up that satellite maybe 10 years ago, there's a huge need for it because a very small piece of orbital debris traveling at 20,000 miles per hour can be catastrophic on impact to a valuable satellite. But it's a very challenging problem because satellites are largely made of aluminum, which is free of magnetic forces, so there's no actual easy way to capture the debris.
Got it. Thank you.
I don't know enough about lasers or anything else to know if that's an economically feasible way of cleaning debris.
I don't know either, but I'm getting really interested in space trash right now.
That's right. We'll go up there with our recycle bags.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is kind of a trade-off of, we have the infrastructure in place to build satellites and put a new satellite up. We don't have the infrastructure at all to build a roving spacecraft that could go and collect and vacuum up stuff. So it's really just the investment and the business case. If Air Force said, hey, we just lost one or two $2 billion satellites, we could have put that money into saving them. Here's $2 billion. Let's go figure it out. That's when it happens. But I don't think you're going to see it from a private customer yet. So
yeah, that's exactly right.
And so, Neal, would you know the guy to go to at the Air Force to pitch him this?
I could help figure that out. Yeah, there's probably a few people that we could find out.
All right, I'm down.
We are on a space trash hunt right now. You're going to help us. That is fabulous. So, Neal, I had
one quick thing. I'm going to give
open it up to questions, but I had a really, really quick question about, we're talking a lot about funding and getting involved, and what do you see as kind of the end game for these companies, right? So when I was doing some research, there's not a lot of acquisitions, right? I think this private-public, partnership in terms of aerospace is relatively new. So what do you see as the end game acquisition play?
Yeah, that's a tough one to regard that there's only so many customers, right? So right now, SpaceX is the big player, and they've declared that we're going to build it all ourselves. They're kind of the Apple, right? They want their whole ecosystem. Mm. What they will do is acqui-hire. So they will look for talent teams that they're missing. And so I see talent moving around in the industry, kind of going to them, or really a lot going to Blue Origin lately. But I think what we need to look at is where do the next big customers come from? And so if we unlock satellites the way that we're doing, what services can be moved to satellite? And in a sense, this new version of wireless that we don't think about right now. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be more on the services side, like what can satellites do beyond just beam internet and beam us direct TV and satellite radio. I think that is an area where we might find a whole new customer, and therefore you could see some kind of big giant come to that. But from the rocket engines and the rockets themselves, hard to say who buys them, except for maybe if you look at some of the players from, say, Space Shuttle and others who got pushed out by SpaceX. they may consolidate and buy their way back in. So you might see Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman somehow buy their way back into trying to compete with SpaceX or catch up. So I think you'll see some big space maybe get there. But yeah, and maybe, Rocket Lab and others, maybe they go public. I don't know if SpaceX, if that's a plan for them. I'm honestly not sure what their end game is. I don't know if it matters right now. Same with Blue Origin being just Jeff Bezos' pet project.
Yeah.
I don't think it's about a business that they're trying to run. I think
Blue Origin is that it is just him and like a ton of grants. That's it.
Yeah. Right.
It's crazy. So
right. And we've had a number of those. We've had, there was Richard Branson is another one. And then there's we had one where it was, what was the former co-founder of Microsoft, and he was going to launch rockets to go mine. Paul Allen had his own, right? So there's a lot of it's kind of the billionaires who can afford to build these right now. So I hope that we get back into I think if we've cracked the private side and we're seeing Rocket Lab and a lot of these others build from scratch, I think there's a potential where we could see some conglomerate come together that could compete with these.
Yeah. Yeah.
Real quick, the background here, I want to give a shout out that you can go see my desk coffee mug. This is it right here, the white, and my chair in the LA Space Air and Space Museum. So we donated our entire mission control. We literally, this is what I worked on. We donated it.
Cool.
And so if you go see Endeavor, they take you through this part first. And yeah, and I can
So
give
how
a
do I
private
identify, when I take my kids, how do I identify which seat is yours? Is that mug still there, or?
It says, it is, but it says performance engineer above my seat.
Got it.
Very cool.
I'd be open to doing like a TCA road trip one day, probably
Yes.
months from now, where we go. I'm totally down to go walk and see the Endeavor and other stuff like that. It'd be fun.
Sign me up.
Cool.
Look at Jason's background. I like that.
Tron.
And talk about Viasat. You've been very quiet.
Actually, and I'm not at Viasat anymore. So.
Oh, maybe that's why.
But I partly was there because I thought space was really cool. This is a really cool talk, Neal. That's really neat about your coffee mug there. I want to see that. Thanks.
The mug isn't as cool as the countdown and everything experience,
Yeah,
but
for sure.
It's cool to me.
But it's neat that you have a piece of your history in a museum.
Jason, you, when you were with TCA and invested, I think, in the company even before that, led a 3D metal printing company.
I was thinking about that as you were talking.
Fabricate Labs, local,
yeah.
right? And
they're doing well. Yeah, they're there in Sorrento Valley doing well. So they're continuing to progress their 3D printing metal technology. They've got contracts with BMW and Stanley and a bunch of others.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Is it FDM or is it sintering or what kind of 3D printing?
So you're probably exceeding my expertise here, but it uses metal suspended in fluid, and then they use
Lasers,
like LCD, like the TFT electromagnet or whatever.
yes,
sorry,
I've seen these guys pitch
Yeah,
at
exactly.
Evo Nexus. Yes,
To
yes,
bind
yes.
the atoms that are in the fluid down, and so it can print these very complex structures that are really, really solid because all of the atoms of the material are lined up in a precise fashion, which doesn't happen with the laser powder systems or other systems. So they're able to produce these very precise, very dense, hard metal objects.
What's the name of that company, Jason?
It's called Fabric 8 Labs. You can look it up on the web. It's Fabric and the number 8, the symbol 8.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, I got to get out of this spacesuit. I'm sweating.
Looks cool.
It's cool. Hey, thanks for the presentation, Neal. Very cool.
Thanks for joining us on the Tacos and Tech podcast with Neal Bloom. Thanks again to Cox Business for helping make this possible by expanding the reach of the San Diego tech ecosystem. Big shout out to School of Rap for our rad intro music, and thanks as well to Nest Podcast Network, where we are recording live inside their studio at Nest Co-working in Bankers Hill. You can find Neal Bloom on Twitter @NealBloom,
as well as Fresh Brewed Tech and Tacos and Tech Pod on Twitter too.
Startups get the party started. You want tech and tacos, tacos and tech. You know we got it.